Awesome. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today for a discussion on what to do with developer productivity metrics. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with DX. It's going to last about 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists are going to head over to our lead dev Slack to answer questions in the Engineering Velocity channel. I'd also love to answer questions live. So if you look below, you can see Zoom has a Q&A feature. So you can start asking your questions throughout. I'll try and weave them in as we're talking about certain things, and anything we don't get to, I'll either answer at the end or pull it into our Slack channel if we don't get to it. So let's kick it off with some introductions. My name is Dominique Simno-Ritchie. I'm a CTO. I've led engineering teams at Affinity, Shopify, Lever, among others. I'm helping teams scale, navigate change, and often having to change something based on developer productivity and improve the experience. I'm excited to be joined by Rafe Colburn, Helen Greal, and Laura Taco, who will share their expertise and real-world insights. Can you all introduce yourselves?
Sure, I can go first, I guess. I'm Rafe. I'm the CPTO at Depop, which is a London-based marketplace for clothing resale, and we're part of Etsy. I worked at Etsy for a long time before I was here, but I've been here about 3 years. And yeah, to the next one.
Hi everyone, I'm Helen Greal, VP of Engineering at Multiverse, London-based platform shaping the future of on-the-job education. Before this, I led engineering for Backstage developer platform at Spotify. And throughout my career, I've been deeply focused on all things platform development and just democratizing great developer experience. I'm really passionate about developer productivity and continuously look for ways to help teams build efficiency at scale. So over the past decade, I've leveraged various frameworks, tools, and data-driven strategies to improve engineering efficiency, all while working alongside some absolutely rockstar teams. So I'm really excited to share those insights today and learn from the discussion.
Thanks, Helen. I'm Laura Taco. I'm the CTO at DX. I'm also the co-author of the Core 4 framework, which is a unified framework bringing DORA, Space, and DevX together to help you answer the question, what on earth should I measure? Like Helen and Rafe, I spend a lot of my time, all of my time thinking about developer productivity. I have been working in developer tooling one way or another for about 15 years now. I was heavily involved in Docker and CI/CD, containerization, infrastructure engineering. And that led me sort of maybe inevitably to the space I'm in now, which is trying to figure out how to optimize these systems, processes, tools in the developer experience to make software development a frictionless experience so that developers can just get really great work done and get it out to your users. So I'm happy to be here and looking forward to learning from my fellow co-panelists and answering your questions.
Awesome. So I thought we would start with how leaders typically use metrics in their organizations. And Laura, in your role, you see firsthand how many engineering leaders and CTOs do this. What do you think the most common use cases are for using developer productivity metrics?
Yeah, Dominique, I think this is such an important question because we're going to spend time during this discussion talking really about what to do with the metrics once you have them and not really focusing on what you should be measuring in the first place, because we can refer you to different resources on the answering of that question. I think one of the reasons that people get stuck when they have metrics is because there's actually a lot of different use cases for metrics. And it's important to understand your use case to make sure that you have kind of the right mindset and the right strategy to get them off the ground and for them to be actually useful to your team. So you might be using metrics for improving the developer experience, for continuous improvement. That's definitely one use case. You might be needing to report on performance up to your board or to your executive team. That's another use case. You might even be using metrics like, Helen has a really deep platform engineering background, and some platform engineering teams, many of them use developer experience metrics or developer satisfaction metrics as their user research, sort of solving that existential question of what on earth should we build next? Can we validate impact? And so, there's probably one or more of those use cases that's important for you and your metrics use, but it's important to think about what your intention is, because without that, you might be kind of chasing the wrong thing or kind of get stuck in the mud.
Yeah, definitely. And often when you get started, I personally, what I've found is teams usually first start to think about how am I going to use this data actually at the last point, once you already have collected everything. So you've spent all this time putting together the right developer questions, maybe putting out a survey, collecting metrics. but then you finally realize, oh wait, I've got to do something useful with this data. And so maybe we should start there. So Rafe, what do you do immediately when a survey closes?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I do look at the kind of at the survey results and look at the kind of versus the industry benchmark and then versus the last survey, and just kind of see what's changed. Are metrics moving? And then kind of from there, I'll usually dive straight into the comments and just see. Our team's about 150, so I can actually just read all the comments, but I usually start at the ones that seem to have interesting results that stand out to me. Yeah, and I find it really, really useful. I think so much good stuff comes out in the comments that I do find I need to kind of get into that detail to get a feel for what people are really experiencing.
Yeah, and I guess as Laura was saying earlier, like one of the use cases for uh, like the more early soul searching type of experience with metrics, like you don't get to experience that very often in organization. And I'm just like right now in this very intense but very excited moment when I get to like really define the focus for the engineering strategy for my organization. And for that, like this whole process of defining the focus area and like the practical steps and the metrics we want to move, like both qualitative and quantitative data play a really key role in validating assumptions, exploring opportunities, identifying like those very practical focus points. And as I work to pinpoint the biggest developer productivity blockers, I relied very heavily on the data to guide my approach and to just like really help me to get down to a hypothesis level, so we can actually kind of be very practical as well as like very strategic. We use DX as a main tool here at Multiverse, so it was like really helpful for me to be able to triangulate like the qualitative data that I get from the comments with the quantitative data that I get from certain tools. And just to give one example, we've been trying to pinpoint like local development has come up as like a really big bubble of like negative sentiment on the snapshot. But then when you go down to like specific measures of like what exactly in the local development, like what is it in the inner loop of a developer that makes an experience like a bit more problematic, it was really helpful to see like the exact measures of like where in the cycle people get stuck. So I think both kind of qual and quan are quite important when it comes to like what on earth should we be measuring, what on earth should we be building, what on earth should be part of your engineering strategy. So definitely soul searching with metrics is an exercise every leader goes through.
It sounds like you do a lot of what I've done in the past too. Is you look for hotspots in feedback, like what is it that people are giving comments on? What are the things that are truly like not the same, either much lower or much higher than one might expect as a way to get started? Like these are the areas to potentially improve. Laura, do you have a different perspective, or do you have maybe a more holistic perspective on the things that are most important to look at?
Yeah, I think what the process that Helen is describing here of looking to qualitative developer feedback is really kind of a shortcut and an orientation piece. Like it's really a compass to guide you to where the most important interventions are. Because the fact is, the developers are in this tooling every day, all day. Like they really know where the problems are because they're running into this friction all the time. And so when when someone asks me like, where should I start? What should I do? What metrics should I start to collect? We can talk about Core 4 and we can I'll leave the link to kind of the summary paper and the framework and why it was designed as a homework activity for all of you listening in. But my more generic advice is just to start with a survey and start by listening to your developers. It is a massive, massive, massive shortcut, because the anti-pattern is that if you don't do that and you just start collecting all of the quantitative workflow data, and then you look at all this data, it is so difficult to orient yourself or to do the soul searching as Helen and Rafe have called it. It's just overwhelming. It's really hard to distill meaning and interpret that data without the qualitative lived experiences of your developers. So that's definitely where I would recommend people start first, is like looking at that qualitative data, the self-reported data. Your developers know where these problems are, so just listen to them. And that is a good jumping off point to then start going down, figuring out where the problems are, picking out smaller improvement metrics to track your progress, and kind of taking the program, getting it started from there and then running with it.
I think maybe one thing I would add is when I'm, probably because I run product too, I'm always looking at product metrics as well. And I think a lot of times, we collect a lot of product metrics, and I do like having access to them. And what I will usually do is I just like to look back really longitudinally. So I'll look back 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and just see which metrics are moving and think about which metrics we've tried to move. And I think a lot of times when I look at developer metrics, you look and they just don't move very much, at least on a per head count basis, and so that's interesting. Then I think, okay, well, I need to, I can go into the qualitative data, but the ones that do stand out for some reason, either whether they're getting better or worse or whichever it is. And so I find that context gathering just to see like what changes and what doesn't to be like a really nice compliment, especially if I don't know what metrics to look at. But it's probably not too useful to look at the ones that don't change. It's the ones that are changing that at least maybe are interesting. And then from there, you can say, okay, here are the ones based on all of this that I might want to change on purpose. And you may come up with a strategy. But I think having a nice spectrum of metrics and looking over a long period of time and just kind of seeing what stands out, I do find to be a useful activity.
It's a good reflection as well, right? Because you're taking a look at what happened before, and ideally you did take changes, you did take actions to try and improve it, and you can see whether or not those worked. And so maybe thinking forward, so now you've looked at your hotspots, you have an idea of what you might work on. How do you actually decide or drive improvements in your organization based on what you've observed? Rafe, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure, I can start us out. I mean, I think a lot of it is this is something I try and delegate and slash listen to the people who are on my team. They generally have a plan. They feel like they know what they need to work on. And in some ways, the data we find in DX, either through qualitative or quantitative, might support or maybe invalidate those plans a little bit. And so how do we just kind of QA what people are doing or pressure test what they're doing against the data that we have, I find is really, really useful. I tend to, I don't think the uptake is incredibly high. If I look at the graphs and say, here's what you need to be doing. It's much better if I say, what are you doing? And let's just make sure it really makes sense. So that's my usual approach.
Helen, do you have a different approach, or how do you think about prioritization or kind of laddering into what you're going to work on?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's not so much maybe about laddering, but more about connecting, like the leading indicators with like lagging, more strategic outcome-driven metrics. And Rafe, I would be really curious also to get your take on this, because you're kind of sitting on both chairs, right, between product and engineering. And like I tend to bridge those worlds quite a bit, because as a leader, like you work with a range of metrics and they span from leading indicators to lagging outcomes. And typically you'd set the goals that fall on like more of the lagging end of spectrum, but the downside is really hard, or like takes a bit of time to see like those moving, actually, if ever. And these are things like revenue trends or monthly active users or like user satisfaction. And these are low noise, so you can actually trust them and they don't fluctuate drastically, like they're hard to game. But then like what I tend to do with platform teams is that I'm trying to help them to kind of really connect their like quick tactical metrics that are like a bit more noisy, a bit more gamifiable, to more of like the lagging product indicators or like outcome-driven types of metrics, and not to kind of shoehorn them necessarily, but sometimes it's just like a missing link, because engineers doing engineering in their kind of left corner while product kind of working towards product goals. But in reality, things like, I don't know, reducing deployment lead time by X% can accelerate like marketing by 2 campaigns. And this link is usually not something that is on the surface for folks. So yeah, that's kind of where my eye goes first. But I wonder like what other perspectives people have on this.
Maybe before somebody else jumps in, you mentioned gamification, which has come up a lot lately. We've talked about Goodhart's law, when metrics lose value when they actually become targets. Laura, do you have an opinion on maybe like what guardrails you might set, or how you might set meaningful goals without undermining the metrics themselves?
I think the example that Helen brought up is really great, and I'll sort of unpack it to help you understand, or to help the listeners understand like why that why it's great, because Helen mentioned that we want to take like a low noise, hard to game metric, such as like active users or revenue, and then match it up with things that are maybe more susceptible to gaming. And making a multi-dimensional system of measurement is one of the ways that you can help kind of protect yourself about gamification. So Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it's no longer a good measure. It's kind of the law that we all know and love to cite, especially around developer productivity metrics. I mean, I think a lot of us have personal experience maybe working on teams where we set the goal of more story points per sprint, and then everyone just starts inflating their story points. And like, this is a great example of Goodhart's law in action. But it has the two big design flaws. One, it's really single dimensional. It's not multidimensional. We're only looking at story points. So that's the one thing. And then the second thing is tying especially individual incentive to that one-dimensional metric just makes it so ripe for gamification, because humans are hardwired to try to get as much incentive out of a system, especially if we feel threatened. It's like our job security, promotion, bonus, even just praise or goodwill can be enough to motivate someone to want to act in a bad way. So what Helen's saying about putting these metrics together, and Rafe in his role as a CPTO is product is a great place to learn some of these strategies of trying to look at many dimensions of a system and really get this like spectrum of metrics, so that we're looking at how the system is behaving, not just how one thing is behaving. That's a really effective way to insulate yourself from gamification. We can't prevent it outright, but at least we can try to hinder some of the negative effects.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add to this is, how do we stay in a kind of like outcomes over output mindset? And I think, and I get the craving. I mean, every product team has it too. And it's even kind of harder on platform teams to say like, boy, we need a driver tree that takes us from, number of pull requests per engineer per week to experiment velocity to, buyers over MAU to sales. Like maybe that would be a crazy driver tree. But like, as you get to the further reaches of the driver tree, boy, causality becomes a little bit harder to, to isolate, right? And I think it is helpful to say, okay, what do we, what's something that's hard to disprove, so we say, okay, well, if we're in the business of trying things, the way we kind of represent trying things is experiment velocity. And so we think experiment velocity is good to a point. If, it's gameable, right? Like the other thing, so I think you have to kind of bring some logic into it. I don't think like just more is more. We had a really good example with experiment velocity here, which was, our experiment velocity was really low, and so we set a goal like experiment velocity needs to be high. Well, guess what? Of course, Goodhart's law, completely people cranked up the experiment velocity to like a really nice level, but all the engineers were complaining, rightfully so, that we were really running like not very good experiments, but we were running a lot of them. And I think you kind of have to watch these metrics and say, what is good enough? Is this no longer the hindrance? And we said, you know what, this is plenty of experiments. Now what we want is experiment quality to go up, better hypotheses, meteor experiment. Let's maintain this velocity. This velocity is fine. And so I think another kind of prevention here is just like, is understanding like what your binding constraints are. And once it's no longer your binding constraint, you don't need to keep working on it anymore. You need to be working on the new binding constraint. So anyway, I think that's another kind of Goodhart's law thing, is just like more is not always better. More is better to a point.
It's also really helpful just to know that people are going to use the metric. It's a really great motivator. And so I often will design quarterly goals around, well, maybe the quarterly goal is more like, let's improve quality or let's do something like this. But for this quarter, I'm going to pick a metric, which I don't love, or that's not perfect, because if we go too far that way, it's going to end up getting us into territory where we've actually gone into the wrong place. But by only picking it for that specific quarter, you're making sure that it's not going to end up bleeding into the next one. It's definitely like you can use this to your advantage.
I just want to jump in really quick to kind of add a thought to Rafe's comment before we move on, which is that I think Goodhart's law is often used as an excuse to not set targets or to maybe avoid using metrics altogether. And I think what Rafe has just shown us is a really good example of working with Goodhart's law instead of using it as an excuse to back away and say, let's not do it. Because what you've described, Rafe, is like a great example of scaffolding metrics and kind of scaffolding the adoption of the metric, the use of the metric, the way that your team uses it for improvement. One of the I think one conversation I actually had today, earlier today, was about PR throughput. And so number of pull requests or merge requests per engineer. And a question that I got was, well, like, how do we know if not, is it just like people submitting typos or whatever? Are we just splitting up work into smaller batches? And I think my response to it was like, probably that's going to happen. And also that's probably fine because in order to sustain a higher velocity, you need to get people used to working in smaller batch sizes. And I think we can split hairs and probably have a whole 2-hour, 4-hour discussion on like how small a PR can be until it's not useful anymore. But the idea here was like, just as Rafe suggested, let's first work on getting used to the velocity and then we can improve the quality or complexity, but we don't have to do all of those things all together at once and then think that we failed if we can't achieve it all. We have that pattern in so many other parts of our daily life, habit stacking and all these other things. And a lot of the physics of how to change a habit, they apply to engineering teams, to product teams as well. We just have to, maybe do a little bit of reflection to figure out how those patterns actually match. But it's a very useful one. I think this scaffolding and working with Goodhart's law instead of using it as a reason to just not engage to begin with.
If I could add one thing, I think the other thing that I've seen a lot also in product metrics is, like, boy, it's dangerous to really think about one metric alone. And I mean, the one that I've seen in product, and I think it applies in engineering as well, is like there's a metric you use in your business forecast. So let's say signups is part of the forecast. We want the sign up count tells us how much money we're ultimately going to make. Well, the product team can go make sign up easier, but what they wind up doing is just shifting the choke point somewhere else. And so you don't, and so you always need those things. And I think like PR velocity is, there are pros and cons to it, but if you don't look at like the size of the PRs along with it, and so, like, okay, we have 20 more, but everyone is much tinier. That may hit your like ways of working goal, but it's probably not producing a bunch of new functionality. Maybe it's going to produce less functionality because your code review process is slow. And so even though we're making the same magnitude of changes, now we're in the next metric in the funnel, and the next metric, the funnel is strained because people aren't fast on them anyway. And so you kind of have to look at them in their larger kind of like funnel context, or you just wind up with these weird distorted things where it's like, boy, the metric we cared most about is getting so much better and nothing feels any different, or things feel worse sometimes. So yeah, I think there's like, maybe caution indicated.
Definitely.
I hope you're enjoying this video, but did you know Lead Dev has a lot more to offer?
When I think about Lead Dev, I think about bricks and hearts. Bricks are those foundational things that you need to know, and Lead Dev provides that through webinars, through videos, through cutting edge research. But hearts are the things that you need to glue yourself to the people at work. And Lead Dev does that through conferences and meetups.
Make sure you check out leaddev.com.
So Laura, you mentioned habits, and I think that's a really great way to start talking about how teams should use metrics. So as engineering leaders, we're all really used to looking at them and like setting our goals, figuring out how we fit that into strategy. But now I've seen that the most effective way to get change is to actually get individual engineers, sometimes engineering managers, or even product managers looking at the data to take action on it. And so, Helen, maybe you want to kick us off. Let us know, how do you practically like roll this out into everyday team processes and how they work?
Totally. And like metrics truly need to be second nature in order for this to work. So like, I guess, Laura, you had a perfect segue with habit stacking. And like, for those who have toddlers and like get them ready to school, I'm sure you can relate. It's like very much about have you packed your lunch? Like, put your hat on, like that. It needs to become part of the checklist. Like, have you checked your metric as part of your planning? Have you checked your metric as part of your reflection exercise, like be it a retrospective? Like, you make them visible, you put them on screens. Like, there is an MIU in the hallway. Why there isn't like a developer experience index next to this metric? Things like that. So my philosophy has been just like make them part of daily life, weave them into, like, not shoehorn them like where it doesn't make sense, but like keep it light, focus on improvement, focus on things that matter, and then just make them part of like day-to-day rituals, be it like Scrum Agile rituals, be it just like some engineering focused huddles, weave them into conversations. Like in my weekly with like engineering directors, it's also very much like a stand-in topic, check in on trends when it comes to developer experience survey and like some throughput metrics that we care a lot about, and those kind of shift depending on the moment in, but it also like a stand-in topic on the agenda.
Great. And you mentioned rituals and like you talked about maybe like retros. Do you provide engineering leaders or managers with anything that they're expected to like show up with at any of these ceremonies? Like how do you equip them with the knowledge and the metrics to be able to have that conversation?
Yeah, it's templatized within our org, and like as an engineering leader, like responsible for an individual team or like maybe for a product group that comprises of multiple teams, you are sort of like responsible or being held accountable towards a set of engineering metrics. And like to me, this is uh, like a conversation starter. Like we align on sort of the baseline where what things should look like ideally, and when there is a deviation happens, it gives me an indicator like, hey, we need to have a conversation. And then it's very much like a conversation starter with that engineering leader, like, hey, why is it we're off? And sometimes like these are things outside of their control, but sometimes these are like very tangible like correlations or causations with something that is happening. But to me, that is like a red alert or like yellow alert that goes off, like, hey, conversation is due to happen here. But like I think it's really helpful to have those expectations be explicit and consistent. Like you don't want, I don't know, 5 different ways of looking at metrics if you have like 50 engineering teams. So like consistency is key. You need to be speaking the same language. You need to have shared vocabulary around those things, both with your peers, with your reports, with your superiors, and then it all kind of starts to make sense as a larger narrative, as a larger story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is like using the same data as well means that they can talk amongst each other to learn from one another about what they're doing too. So it becomes more bottoms up that way versus doing it another way.
Precisely. Yeah, it's more like it's part of, I guess, creating community of your engineering leaders, because like as a VP, as a CTO, you can't be in every conversation, but you lead with like a policy in a way, or you lead with set of expectations, and you also build a community and inner sourcing way for them to kind of share and cross-pollinate and learn from one another. So that has been like really helpful technique, I guess.
Yeah. Rafe, how do you get teams to engage with data in a way that feels useful?
I mean, I think this is one of the hardest problems, actually. Because I think there's some set of people, and I think it's probably a minority, who are just, they do it on their own. They're like, oh man, I want to understand what's going on. And one way to understand this, I look at these dashboards and they build their own dashboards. I'm very much this type of person. And I think the other way is, probably mostly, your boss cares about it. And so, if your boss comes in and like, oh, I saw something surprising in the data, then you're like, oh, shoot, I didn't look at the data this morning. I guess I better look right now. And so I think it's kind of up to us as leaders to pull it into context for people in one way or another. And even then, though, I think for it to sift through all the layers turns out to be pretty hard. It's nice when people do it, but I've never had that, like, I mean, and I would love it, that magical thing where it's like, oh, we've all looked at the dashboard and have the same context. It just doesn't seem to work for me. I don't know exactly know why.
Well, it sounds like maybe Helen makes it happen by showing that she's paying attention because she's asking the question, right? And so Carlo asked a question, which is really great, is like, can you share what those like 4 or 5 measures that you consistently use across the teams or areas with your teams?
Yeah, happy to answer live really quickly. Like the typical, I guess, 4 measures, like they're not some rocket science, like things that you would expect, sort of. So it's more like around how your team is spending time, like what's the distribution of work, like building new features as opposed to like dealing with fires or addressing some technical debt. There is like an efficiency measure when it comes to like throughput. We have a measure for that. There is like a overall team health, team vibe, attrition type of measure that we talk about, as well as quality and stability. So these are, I guess, the 4 pillars that like all engineering leaders on my teams are expected to pay attention to. And then like if something goes south, obviously, like it's a conversation starter, just like I said, for us to maybe go deeper and like look into some more dashboards or have a conversation about specific situation.
That's great. Laura, in your communication with lots of different CTOs and teams, what are some examples of companies you've seen successfully use metrics to kind of drive that continuous improvement?
Yeah, I mean, I think Helen's a great example, Multiverse. And Rafe's done great work at Depop. But aside from them, I think Dropbox is doing some really interesting stuff because they have that, Carlo, you pointed out like Helen's the one, she's asking about it, she's interrogating it. Everyone's looking at it. Drew, Halston from Dropbox is like, he's a developer, so he's looking at these metrics and really driving it from the top. And I think organizations that do a good job of using metrics for continuous improvement have sufficient pressure at the top that it's like, listen, this is an important thing. And as an engineering manager, you're not doing your job if you're not participating in these continuous improvement loops. It doesn't mean that we're tying bonuses to particular results, because then I think we get into gamification area. But I think it's totally reasonable to say, Dominique, your job is to, like, I need evidence that you're using this data in your, your ceremonies, your rituals with your teams as a management tool, so that your team can be more effective. And I think companies that really do continuous improvement well have that executive sponsorship, that drive from the top, but they also have real results and close the loop on the bottom. So just today, Adrian, who's one of the developer or engineering effectiveness directors at Tesco, posted about participation rate for their developer satisfaction survey. If you've run an engagement survey on your own, you know that participation rates are really low because we just don't really close the loop. And so we're trying to get data, we're asking engineers for data. Maybe they're giving us their opinion, but when we don't close the loop, we give them little incentive to actually continue to share their opinion with us. And then we just get incomplete data that leads us to the wrong conclusions. And it's just this, it doesn't work. It's hard to get that off the ground. And what Adrian shared in his post was like the last 4 developer satisfaction surveys that they've run have been 90+% participation rate. So like the engineers themselves are finding a lot of value in sharing their experiences because teams are triaging data themselves. They're in the data, they see how it's impacting them. And so the other part of it is like squeeze from the top, put pressure from the top, have really strong executive guidance, but also make it really, really tangible what this data is doing for your individual team members, because they're the ones who are most impacted by it. And so if they see the value, you have a way higher chance of success of getting kind of metrics as a muscle building and that heart beating in your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's both like at the individual team level and also at the leadership level that you can do this. When I joined Affinity, we did a developer survey, and we had done one a year before, and we tried to keep a couple of questions consistent so that we could have that data tracked over time. But having been new, I didn't think to close the loop on what predecessors might have done. And so the results were 72% of people, that was actually pretty good, participated. But then this year when we ran it, we gave, here's everything that we did, here's what the impact was, and people started to see how we were setting quarterly goals, and we got to 100% even faster than we got to the 70%. And so I definitely think that closing the loop is like a very, very important part of doing this well. So we're getting close to the end, so let's move on quickly. As engineering leaders, We often have to communicate these to cross-functional peers. I know I like to leverage these as much as I can, communicating to the board as well. But depending on what the perception is of your engineering team and what's needed, they either kind of, maybe people don't pick up on it, or maybe it doesn't necessarily help you tell your story. So what are some ways that you've been successful using these metrics? Maybe Laura, you want to keep going on this one. How would you recommend that we use data to report to leadership and the board?
Yeah, I think there's, I think kind of bottom line here is that whenever you're talking and using metrics, you have to think about it as a product. Like you are creating a product for an end user. And when your end user is an executive, you need to understand what the pain points are, what they're trying to do with the data, what decisions they need to make with the data, so that you can build a product that fulfills their needs. You know, I hate to see an engineering manager spend all this time putting together a dashboard only to go into an executive meeting and for it to just sort of fall flat, because it's hard to interpret the data. It's not addressing a real pain. You know, I think storytelling with data is a really important skill, building a narrative with data. What are we trying to talk about here? There's a big difference between going into an executive meeting to try to show the impact of your initiatives and saying, listen, you know, this metric has stayed stagnant for the last 12 months. It's become now like it's on fire, right? We got to do something about this, like this issue, because we've been trying to address it. It hasn't. We've been able to move some of the people who were mostly satisfied into very satisfied with this particular aspect of developer experience, but we haven't been able to move the people who are neutral or less satisfied up anything. And so we're seeing movement with people who are already okay, but we're not seeing movement down here. We need more budget. We need, you know, more cross-cutting platform initiatives. The data shows us that this is how these populations are, you know, experiencing, reacting to whatever it is that we're doing. That is super clear about what the populations are, who's affected. We can start putting together ROI, maybe of impact, versus a dashboard that just has the number and says it's like, oh, it's just stayed the same. And, you know, I hope to think if you're taking the time out of your day to attend a webinar like this, that's not going to be the kind of person that you are. It's just to show a number on a black and white board, but really getting into the needs of your stakeholders, getting into calculating ROI and being really comfortable talking about the business side, and then using data to support that story. That is what is going to make these metrics really powerful when you need to use them to report up on performance.
I guess I can jump in. I mean, basically what I found almost without fail is that nobody cares about the engineering metrics if the product metrics look good. And, you know, like if you're growing at the rate you want, and mostly outside of engineering, I think because they are hard to approach from an engineering point of view, people don't look at them all the time. And so what happens is the engineering metrics sort of rise to the executive level when people are concerned that engineering productivity is the constraint on getting the product outcomes that people want, almost inevitably. And so then I think, you know, in that world, I agree so much with what Laura said, which is it's not metrics, it's the storytelling. Like, how are we doing as an engineering team? What evidence can we show in data that this story is true and that we're getting what we need to do, and what might we change? You know, and I think a lot of times it's org structure. We need to be working more on the app and less on the website, or we need to be doing this. And you can see that we now see much more PRs on the app than we see on the other things. Or, you know, we're not learning quickly enough and our feedback loops are too slow. And you can see we're deploying a lot more now and we're doing more releases, and that's going to enable us to learn faster. But like, it needs to be in that way, at least connected in terms of a narrative to how you're helping the company execute, you know. And I think if you do that, you're probably in good shape. If it's just like, hey, look, PRs are up, I just don't, you know, it's like, that's a number, but I don't, no executive in the world is going to care about it. You know, it's gotta tie back to what they care about, which is value creation from engineering. Engineering's the biggest investment area in almost every tech company. Maybe at some it's marketing, but you know, people ask people a lot of questions about marketing data, and so it's not surprising when when things are more of a struggle, that you see it more from engineering, which is I think why we see so much of it now, as opposed to the wonderful 2010s when money was free and everyone was growing.
Yeah, ultimately people want to see, what are you shipping? What are the features? What are the things that have created value for our customers? And then if you're doing that, then they don't care about your metrics. But if it's not going as fast, then all of a sudden, I think there's a really great opportunity to tell linking those metrics together. Helen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, Rafe, what you just said, and yeah, that resonated deeply, and I think that's a really fair summary of like nobody looks into it until things are on fire or like things start to smell, and it's really tricky to be able to kind of turn around that narrative from like being defensive, no, it's not engineering that is a problem here, and make it into more like opportunity driven, opportunity based. So I think what I found being like really successful in those executive rooms is more like it's always a bit of a ratio, like how engineering is spending their time. Like if you put this on a scale, like we spend like X percentage of time doing this and like Y percentage of time doing that. And it's always kind of helpful to like to be able to shift this ratio towards things that are more connected to the value that kind of that is resonating with business stakeholders or product, and that could really frame the discussion. So if it's helpful, we can go down to like developer productivity metrics in that conversation, like where can we invest to be able to like shift that ratio or like shift that goalpost. But rarely starting from developer productivity metrics is a good kind of board meeting. So yeah, definitely +1 to both Rafe and Laura, and storytelling. Not only data literacy, like I used to think that data literacy like is the one that opens the doors, but it's data literacy and storytelling that kind of helps you be successful in those boardrooms for sure.
Well, and one thing that could help with storytelling is if you can talk to where you stand in comparison to peers, because then it kind of wakes up this potential competitive aspect or an understanding of what does that mean from a broader perspective. Laura, what's a best practice related to kind of seeing how you stand compared to others?
Yeah, I think I wanted to just mention one thing before we get into the sort of benchmark, which is for those of you who are very interested in this, how do I report kind of question, or like you're sweating, maybe you got sweaty palms because like you're going to be called on and you're not sure. I want to point out this resource, which comes from Iconic Capital. They have this really great R&D reporting guide, and in there you can find like templates, slides, guidance on frameworks. It's really useful. I think if I'm not mistaken, we're going to send out a follow-up email, and I think we can put in that. Otherwise, if you Google like Iconic Capital R&D reporting guide, there's going to be a lot of really useful stuff in there for you.
Yeah. I'll just add in that they actually publish these on a regular basis and constantly update them based on industry data. And they just released a new one, which is really helpful.
Yeah, so super fresh, super fresh. In terms of using data to kind of assess how you're performing, it's true, especially in these contexts where you're reporting up to a board, they want to know like, well, what does it all mean? Like, what does it mean that our team is spending 60% of our time on innovation and 20% of our time on KTLO? Because really, a lot of these things are relative to your, I mean, wouldn't that be a dream? You only spend 20% of time on KTLO. I'm sorry, I should have picked a more realistic example. But like, a lot of these numbers, it's relative to your competition, because when your competition is spending more time on innovation and less time on maintenance and KTLO, it's only a question of time until they can outpace you. And so for some of these things, external benchmarks can be really useful in helping to do kind of gap analysis and tell the story of like, where could we go? And so, DORA metrics, I think, have become a very gold standard for external benchmarks. Core 4 has external benchmarks included in it as well. I think another really useful thing is internal benchmarking. I personally find that to be the most useful, because we're on a journey of improvement, and so we want to be able to look at where we started and where we are, and how much change has happened, like the good and the bad. But the truth is sometimes we do need to look externally and bring in external benchmarks to have comparison, to kind of help us understand, do we need to make more investment here? Are we falling behind? Do we have a place that's really a competitive advantage? And what do we need to do to protect that competitive advantage? Because there's also a tendency when those, as Rafe said, like when those metrics look good, it's like, okay, well, we can, I guess, forget about them. Or do we really need to keep investing in X area because it seems like it's not really been an issue? And benchmarks can kind of help tell the story again about, well, this is what we can expect to happen if we stop investing here, and this is what the risk will be, and here's how we might fall behind our competitors. So benchmarking can be really useful to kind of give a little bit of narrative context to performance and contextualize how companies are doing.
Definitely. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut off the conversation now. That's all the time that we have for today. So thank you, Helen, Rafe, Laura, for all of your amazing insights. We're going to move over to the Slack channel. Any questions that we didn't answer live are going to get copied over there and answered. So please do stick around and go around. And if there are any other questions you want to ask, you can go in and join the channel as well. And so thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for the great participation and the really good stuff. I hope you all took away something that you're going to apply on your teams.
Thank you all.